Thank you, David, for making this possible.
My pleasure.
Happy belated birthday to
Thank
you.
you very much.
And a happy new year
Thank
for
you.
you.
You too.
Can you tell me how you celebrated your birthday?
Oh, I just had some friends over, a bunch of musicians. We were hanging out and we're listening to mostly not listening, mostly just talking. So a lot of different guys from
Okay.
roughly my age.
Well, on your Facebook profile, I saw a notice, even we can't be friends there because you have too many friends already.
I'll kick somebody off and make you a friend.
You are overloaded with friends, so you're very rich.
I'm a rich man.
Yeah. Well, there I saw that you had a last solo concert at the Soapbox Gallery in Brooklyn in in January, which is like 10 days ago, something like that. And you played songs and improvisations, and you suggested a donation of $10.
Yes, that's right.
How was the concert 10 days ago?
It was fun. I've been doing a lot of solo playing lately. That's kind of a favorite thing of mine. And I have one solo record out, and I'm sort of getting ready to do another one. I think I'm gonna do one in April. I'm gonna do some concerts in Minneapolis in the U.S. and I think they're gonna rent a Fazioli, and we're gonna record it at their for this. Actually, a label. It's kind of I think it's some kind of funding project, like a GoFundMe kind of thing, where people can pre-order the CD. So, at any rate, I've been doing a lot of solo concerts, particularly at this place called Soapbox Gallery, which is in Brooklyn, and it's basically an art gallery. A sculptor kind of runs it, and it's a very beautiful, nice 7-foot Yamaha grand piano, particularly nice instrument, and just sounds really good in that room. So we've actually recorded some solo stuff that might be on that record as well. So it's more of an opportunity. I'm about to, actually I'm here in Europe for a week, and then I'm going to Japan at the end of January, at the beginning of February. I have some concerts there that are sextet and trio, but then I have a week of solo concerts in Japan. So I'm looking for opportunities to play solo as much as possible and to really keep developing that. It's interesting because solo playing is something as practice, as all musicians who practice play a lot of solo. It's what happens when you're practicing for gigs, but to do it with the intention of performing is very different. So that's why I've been seeking out that particular venue.
Yeah. And how did it go with the donation situation?
That particular venue is not a great paying experience, at least not at the moment, but we can keep developing it. That's something I kind of do in coordination with the sculptor that owns the studio. He's trying to find different ways to support some artistic activity in that part of Brooklyn. So I would say it's something that's getting going more than developed. But
okay.
Since we're not in it for the money, that's not so much the issue.
Well, playing solo piano, even recording solo piano, is a big statement, I think. And it's also very intimate because it's you, it's your instrument, and somehow it's the world, right? Why do you play solo, and do you feel lonely then when you play solo?
Well, it's interesting. Sorry, go on.
And do you have a message? And if, does this message also change?
Well, I'd say for me, solo piano playing, the thing that, it can be very different, so like Art Tatum playing solo piano, or Oscar Peterson playing solo piano, or Paul Bley, or Keith Jarrett, or whoever, they're all different kind of approaches. Brad Meldau has a number of solo recordings out, and everybody has a kind of different approach. I would say my approach, it's funny, when my first solo record came out, they reviewed it in the New York Times, and the reviewer wrote, "This is a little bit like listening to someone just," I forget exactly what words he used, but it was almost like, this is like listening to someone practice, or just kind of, it's very intimate what he's doing. And that's actually kind of my goal. I would say I think of solo piano playing as less of a performance and more like there's a an old T.S. Eliot poem where he talks about as if you could have the thoughts in your brain just projected on the wall. I like the idea of I like that it's improvisation, and one thing I'm working on, and I hope to get better and better at doing it, is to sort of make a set of variations. So jazz is often compared to theme and variations as a form, because a theme and variation works with a theme obviously, and then you have variations on that theme. Usually the theme also has a sort of harmonic structure. Jazz tends to be focused on the harmonic structure, that most of the soloing, the improvisation often happens over a form, and that form has a chord progression. So, but what I'm sort of interested in is if I do a tune, a standard, or some Coltrane music or whatever, because I'll get to that in a minute. At any rate, if I'm playing a song like Lazy Bird, which is a John Coltrane tune, I kind of want to have it continue to morph into different things. So maybe I'll start with some kind of statement of the melody, maybe only one hand, and then I'll bring in the left hand, and then we're working with this texture for a while, and then maybe it'll slow down and something else will happen, and maybe that's my goal, is to have this kind of just sort of a series of evolving improvisations based on the idea of this piece, and that it could change tempo or change key, that anything could. We just are kind of looking at the world of Lazy Bird for a moment, and all kinds of different sort of vignettes, variations on that idea. So that is the thing I've been trying to develop, a kind of improvisational approach where sometimes I'm just improvising on free things, and then I'm taking a tune but kind of looking at it in different perspectives. That's kind of my aesthetic for doing this. At least that's part of my aesthetic, I guess I should say. One of the other things I've been looking at is the tentative plan for the recording I'm going to do in April might be the music of John Coltrane and Pete Seeger. I've been playing a lot of their music, and I've actually thought several times of doing a John Coltrane record and also a Pete Seeger record, also Woody Guthrie. These are American folk singers. So some people might not be familiar with John Coltrane, some other people might not be familiar with Pete Seeger. Pete Seeger was the first musician I ever listened to. It was the first record I ever bought, was Pete Seeger's greatest hits. So he wrote We Shall Overcome and some other, plays a lot of Woody Guthrie music. So that music is interesting because, the combination is particularly interesting because John Coltrane is a lot of chords, very often. He's written a lot of complex music like Giant Steps and Countdown and Lazy Bird and Moment's Notice. These are all tunes that have a lot of chords in them and are very harmonically rich. Then you take a song like We Shall Overcome, which is basically a hymn, or other songs that have just 3 chords or 5 chords, very relatively few, it's folk music, so it has a little less harmony. And it's interesting to work at both ends of that scale. So that's one of the things that attracts me to that. And the thing that attracts me to both of those people as solo material for a solo concert or for a solo recording is that you don't expect piano players to do either one of them so much. Like John Coltrane, of course, piano players play his music, but it's something that sax players have played to death. So the piano solo thing has John Coltrane's music as his music also is very, very rich. So you can have some of these complex tunes. He also wrote tunes that are based on 1 chord. So it's kind of, both of those things are not typical for solo piano. So that's part of the appeal of that.
Okay. Well, what is your experience during the composing process when you play solo or for solo project, and also during recording, because you recorded also and you will record?
Yeah.
And you just did.
Yeah, I just have.
And even afterwards, because afterwards I think you have to listen a lot,
yes.
many times.
You do.
So what's your experience with that?
Well, I'd say there's a lot of people who would say that's their least favorite part of it. The last solo record I did with a producer, and I didn't listen to it at all. I just gave all the music to him, and I said, make a record, and he did. And that's a nice project, you can enjoy that. I just finished a sextet record, which is called 6 of 1. It'll be on Palmetto Records, like my last record. That'll be out in a few months, and that was more. I was the producer on that one. Okay, so I really I did listen to it a ton. I listened to it lots and lots of times, and I did something I haven't done in a while because I haven't actually. I mean, my last record before this was another studio project. I also had a producer on that one, so he is the person who really sat with all the takes and really worked on it as more than I did. But this most recent one was the first time in a while where I've acted as a very active producer of a studio project. So what I ended up doing was a lot of sort of post-production things, and I actually enjoyed it a lot. What I say post-production, I added percussion on some tunes. Roger Bacato, who comes to Groningen also sometimes, we did something where we just built kind of almost like a village kind of percussion thing. It sounds sort of African loosely, although of course he's Brazilian. And we changed the groove kind of underneath the piece, and then we took the drums out, and so the thing just sort of morphs into this kind of percussion thing with the sax player Billy Drews playing over it. And actually he played over a different rhythm section, and we kind of just, sort of manipulated it, and that's a lot of fun. I have no problem with that. I think manipulating the sound and changing things and adding instruments or percussion, that's all fair game because recordings are different than live performance. So that was something I hope to do more of in the future. I did actually some manipulation of like some solo piano improvisations on that. I would sort of take one part out and edit, and it's something that classical musicians do all the time when they record solo music. Glenn Gould being famously the first person who kind of started doing that. So that kind of opened my eyes to something I may explore more in the future. I mean, I have done that in the past, but I hadn't done it in a long time. So the next record feels a little bit less like a recording of a performance and more of a recording project. There was another question in there, but I forgot what it was.
What is important?
Oh, composing. You were asking about composing.
Yeah.
So composing for me has always been something that happens. It's sort of, I wrote a lot of new music for this last record. All my records that I've done that are studio projects with multi-horns, they're almost always only my music. This one has, I think, 10 tunes, and 9 of them are new. We re-recorded one older thing that I had done on an earlier record. But this group, the sextet that I play with, is something I've been developing for the last 4 years or so. And so that it's sort of evolved, it's found its own direction. And I've written a lot of music specifically for them. We had a gig where we were playing at Smoke Jazz Club in New York. And the first night, it's a 3-night gig, so it's 3 sets a night, and so it's a lot of playing. And after the first night, I thought, we need a more straight-ahead tune. So I went home and wrote something that afternoon and brought it in, and that was nice because it was responding to a need. It's like you often write. I mean, I often write as a kind of just free associating and seeing what you come up with. But it's also nice to sort of be playing somewhere and have a direction sort of be suggested by what you need programming material. So the thing that I particularly like about this group, that sextet group, is that it's evolved a way to play these tunes. So one of the things about the music I've written for that group is I think it's pretty broad. So we have tunes that are swing and are kind of straight ahead kind of songs. We also have tunes that are more like almost like a classical kind of piece of music for everyone doubles in that band. So there's sometimes clarinets, bass clarinet. Dana doubles on Iwi. Tim Armacost, who is the fourth horn that sometimes comes in, especially when somebody can't make it. So he plays soprano, and so we have a lot of there are a lot of orchestral colors available in that band, and so some of the music goes in this clarinet-y kind of sort of orchestral direction. Also, we have some tunes that are free, and they just improvise sort of freely over them, or other tunes where they have chord progressions. It's varied, and I think that writing for that band and also that band learning how to interpret that music has made it a more personal direction.
Good. What is important for you to get from a solo project? Really, to get from it?
You mean me as a leader solo or a piano solo?
Yeah.
Oh, you know, everybody writes music now, but I do think there are people who have more identity as a composer and people who have less identity as a composer. That doesn't mean that they don't write good music, it's just they don't identify as like that's a significant part of their voice as a player. I'm not going to name any names, but I think there are some people who really exist more as, you know, improvisers, and then the tunes they write are just kind of vehicles for their improvisation. I feel like part of what I do is write tunes, and that I have a voice as a composer, and it's a certain, you know, whatever, it's my style, whatever that is. And so those solo projects are often about that, about giving that space, that voice space, you know. So I tend not to write things that are about like trying to be virtuosic pianist like vehicle things, and more like whatever the direction the tune wants to go. And I've often felt like the composer in me teaches the player in me, because sometimes the composer comes up with things that are hard to play over and then you have to learn how to play on it. I have one tune that I wrote for that group. I actually wrote it for my students because so many of my students are interested in different mixed meter and all this kind of some contemporary things. And this tune I wrote, it's just so hard. I have not managed to get it together to play it yet, but I will. And when I can play that tune, okay, then you've acquired another skill. So, you know, I do think of the solo projects I do as being led by me, usually more as a composer than as a player. Of course, I'm the piano player in the band too, but I sort of separate those two things. And I have to say, I've also been drawn to more, some of my favorite, I guess some of my role models for that are records like Speak Like a Child. Herbie Hancock is one that comes to mind. Herbie is the only soloist on that record, so in a way that is a kind of piano vehicle, maybe more than some of the things I've written. But it's also, there's a lot of restraint in it, you know, and it sort of feels like not just about, you know, kind of providing something for the you know, a vehicle for the pianist as like this kind of very muted thing where people, you know, where you really hear, I think of Speak Like a Child first and foremost as the compositions. So, you know, I guess maybe that's something of what I'm going for.
Do you also have to deal with compositions that are maybe not good enough? You know,
my own?
Yeah. That
yeah,
that belong to the trash and they go directly there and that's it?
Well, I don't, that doesn't happen. I mean, of course, yes. I mean, I've written lots of stuff and I haven't recorded most of it. So, you know, the things you record are combinations of the things that are recordable or like playable, that, you know, that resonate with the band. You know, sometimes you have a good idea that just doesn't ever come across. It's interesting actually playing solo. One of the things that I've been doing I've mentioned the Coltrane and the folk music, but I also do a lot of my own composition solo. And some of the ones that I do are ones that I could never figure out how to play with a band. You know, so I have this one tune called Bach for Dummies that's kind of it sounds vaguely Bach-ish, and it has kind of a complex and abstract harmony kind of structure, and it's a tune that I've been playing a lot solo and I'm really liking. But I like, because one of the things I like about it is the structure of the tune is kind of negotiated by myself, you know, with myself, you know, and it's like leave things out, add bars, change the harmony, all that stuff is fine. So when I played that with a band, it had a tendency to feel kind of stuck and a little bit, you know, heavy, you know, like we're stuck with this heavy harmony and we can't escape it. So that's an example of a song that has really been more effective solo. So that happens. And of course, you know, there are tunes that don't make it. You know, there are a lot of things that you reject, and you know, that is certainly trure. You know, what I found is, even on this last recording we recorded, I think, 13 tunes, and there are, I think, 9 or 10 tunes on the record. So 3 didn't make it, you know, and they just didn't feel special. So that certainly happens.
But how do you decide?
I mean, I decide when I'm listening to it back at the recorder, this one is not really making it. Or, sometimes you feel like it's already been covered. What I find is, like, I've had tunes that I really liked that I thought would make it onto the record. Both with this band and another band that I write for called the New York Standards Quartet, which is mostly based on standard kind of tunes. Arrangements of standards, usually contrafacts, things like that. Songs, the compositions that are kind of come out of a standard or something like Confirmation or musicians' tunes. That I thought where I really liked the composition, we played it and always had something wrong with it. It really never got off the ground. And I keep coming back to it and thinking, even sometimes we've had really good performances of it live, and then you go into the studio and for some reason it just doesn't really make it. There's music you can never, for me it's not like a science in the sense that if I have 8 tunes, we will play them and they will all be on the record. And I don't really approach it that way. It's sort of like you throw stuff against the wall and what sticks. So usually it's obvious if there's something to the tune that you can work with. I have 2 or 3 tunes that I've recorded several times, and I like the tune still, but we've never really gotten a special recording of it. And after a couple of times around, you don't keep bringing it. So eventually they go their way.
Yeah. Well, I noticed that you have something in common with Keith Jarrett and Glenn Gould, especially during playing solo and also solo in a group. It's this humming.
Okay.
So you're singing while you're playing.
Yeah.
Can you explain how this is working with you and where's this coming from and what is it?
Okay. Well, first, let me say that that's a range of humming. That you have Glenn Gould on the one side and Oscar Peterson is another one. There's a lot of people who hum, who make noise when they play. And then you have Keith Jarrett, who is like another level of vocalizing, And I just want to point out that I'm closer on the Glenn Gould side of the spectrum, I think, than on the Keith Jarrett side. So there's a limit to how loud I want to get with that and also how pitchy I'm going to be. But I've known a lot of pianists who do that, and it's funny. One of the things I've been doing at this Soapbox Gallery is I've also been hosting these piano get-togethers where you get 5 or 6 piano players and they play for each other and they play for an audience. But the main thing is to be sitting there playing with 5 other piano players, professional players who you respect and appreciate, and you play solo, then they play solo, and then the next one comes, and it's a little bit of tension actually to feel completely relaxed. But interestingly, you get to see who's a hummer and who's not, and there's always a few. It's not like, so it's a large percentage of people who make some kind of noise. I guess it comes from initially, from wanting to. Piano and guitar are 2 instruments where bass too, I guess, drums also, I guess. But most other instruments are horns and sort of breath based. So I think it's something that maybe starts from a desire to breathe with the music. But to be honest with you, I have no idea how I got started doing it. I've been doing it so long. I really couldn't tell you what's up with that. In the studio, you try to make sure it's not mic'd too loud. We have close miking and it goes towards the instrument. It's usually fine if I'm in a recital hall space that's really live. Sometimes it'll get kind of loud, but one thing I have to say is, like, as a longtime Keith Jarrett fan, among many other pianists, I'm a fan of a lot of great piano players, but I certainly love his playing. That stuff that he does has never bothered me, his vocalizations. Some people really hate it. I don't, for me, if that's the cost of, if that's what it takes for us to hear Keith Jarrett play the piano the way he plays the piano, I think it's worth it. So, and actually it just becomes part of the experience of it. So I don't have a problem with it when other people do it. And I do hear myself do it, but I don't really give myself too much of a hard time about it.
Do you also rehearse a lot? You play every day?
You mean practice myself?
Practicing or whatever, composing or
I practice
being together with a piano.
Yeah, I practice a lot. It varies. It goes up and down. But I have to say, I don't have kids. I'm married. I have a wife, although at times we're separated because she's a Japanese TV actress. So sometimes she's there, and recently we've been together. She has kind of she took a little break from that for a while, for 6 years or so. And so, but even then I'm on the road, so we get separated. But anyway, my point in all that is we don't have kids. We don't have I feel like I have not that many demands. I mean, there are demands on my time, but it's not constant. So I have time to practice, and I do most days. When I'm here for a week and I'm busy teaching all day, I don't practice as much here as I normally would at home. But I try and practice a fair amount. And, there's this great interview with Sonny Rollins that he did recently, because Sonny Rollins can't really play anymore because of his some breathing issues, I guess, or I'm not really sure exactly what he has, but he's not completely healthy, and he can't play anymore. And there's this beautiful interview with him where he talks about, that whole thing, and the interviewer asks him something about his playing, about his practice life, and he was like, yeah, I'm just kind of, how do you feel about it? And he's like, well, I'm just kind of disappointed. Why are you disappointed? He's like, well, I almost felt like I was getting somewhere, It's like, it's Sonny Rollins, he's like probably one of the greatest living tenor players, but it's interesting that, we still have that sense. We're trying to get better. I practice because I want to get better. And, musicians are very idealistic people. We think that we can change and we can improve, and that's what we do, So I practice often. I go through phases where I'm composing a lot, but recently I have not been composing so much, but I have sort of a backlog of stuff I still have to, there's always going to be a backlog because I have lots and lots of music that I never recorded, but that's that.
Okay. Do you also have problems sometimes with your fingers or your arms or muscle problems?
I have in the past. I've had a lot of that. I've had a lot of tendonitis issues and retraining and classical playing and all that kind of stuff. And some medical stuff that there was a period where I got tendonitis when I was 26, when I was going to, I moved to Boston to study with a particular teacher there. And, I got tendonitis problems then, and they had a certain way of treating it, which they don't do anymore, which is isolation and, stopping playing. And, now no one treats that way. But I was pretty much dealing with that for a couple of years. And I would say tendonitis, turns out that there's actually a genetic component to it. Like, you have either you're going to have a predilection towards having some of these problems, or you don't, that part is somewhat genetic. So a lot of people in my family have had tendonitis issues who are not musicians. So that's been an issue. It's not much of an issue. It hasn't affected me very severely in many, 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 many years. But I think the other thing is, there are things that we call tendonitis, and I was talking to a friend of mine who hasn't had those issues, but he said, if he practices, a lot, it's like anything else. You use certain muscles a lot when you practice, and it's easy to, sort of strain yourself. So you have to be kind of careful, but mostly for me, playing is a good therapy. Practicing is harder on your body than playing. When you play, you naturally stop, you feel the rhythm, there's a certain kind of in sync kind of feeling that actually is technically, I think, helpful. So when you're playing music, I've had less problems from playing music, generally speaking, and more problems from doing extended practicing, where you would be less apt to take breaks, and you might try and do something difficult over and over and over again. So that's... Mm-hmm. And the other thing is, as a jazz pianist, you have a fair amount of choice in what you play. So, when I first had any tendonitis problems, I went to a classical pianist, and she said, the teacher, the technique teacher I was working with, she said, I don't understand why any jazz piano player would ever have tendonitis, because you just play less. And while I think that's probably an oversimplification, there is some truth to it, that you have, that you can... there's a certain sense that you play what's in the moment, and if what's in the moment is is a little bit less. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Could be a good thing, in fact. So, that's been, I would say that's an issue in my life that's not entirely black and white, but I feel very comfortable that I can work and not be affected by it.
You are a piano player, an arranger, a composer, an educator, and you are a writer.
Oh, yeah, right.
Yeah. Well, you published 3 books, and they are all related to education somehow. There's the one, it's called The Jazz Musician's Guide to Creative Practicing. Well, is it only for jazz musicians? Or also for electronic musicians, pop and rock?
I mean, it's for anybody who might be interested. Sort of my field is jazz, and the thing that I'm talking about is how to explain the things that you need to acquire in jazz. I think in as a jazz improviser, there are certain things, it's not universal, but there are certain things that most people will have to deal with. For example, playing fast tempos and improvising over fast tempos, improvising over songs where the chords change rapidly, or improving your metronomic time, or learning to feel different meters or grooves, sort of determining how much swing feel you want to have, being able to play what's in your ear. Now, some of those things go across lines to other, rock musicians or pop musicians. So it's not necessarily not applicable to other instruments, but my goal with that book was to try and explain the main problems that I think jazz players encounter, and also to try and develop a practice method or a practice philosophy that's that works, and of course I'm not the last word on this. Everybody who plays has a practice philosophy, and it was interesting when I wrote that book and gave it to people, other jazz musicians to read over. They're like, oh, this is great. It's really terrific to hear how these are practice ideas. I would love to hear their practice ideas. This is a community, and I always enjoy when I go to a workshop and somebody ends up talking about how they practice. So I think there's, basically that's the only thing you really need to know. You don't really need to know anything from a teacher about what they like and what they don't like. That's all, some people like chocolate ice cream, some people like vanilla ice cream. It's not interesting and very often students will give me, recordings of theirs to listen to, and they're like, well, what do you think? Do you like it? And it's like, who cares? I mean, someone loves it, somebody doesn't like it, that's not something you can really do anything about. But if you ask me, how could I work on acquiring some skill that I don't have? Well, that's really useful information. So the point of that book was really about that, and to look at different things that jazz musicians do, from transcribing solos. Actually, the genesis for the book was that I had I did a workshop in a school in North Carolina in the U.S., and the person there said, he's a trumpet player, the jazz director, and he said, in my point in life, I don't get that much practice time. Why don't you write a book where every chapter is a different lesson, and where you could pick up any one of you could start anywhere and just sort of do something about this topic. And that was originally the book I thought I was going to write, and it kind of morphed into this other book. But in that book, there are chapters on giant steps and, rhythm changes and certain problems and more about all the problems that you encounter, So there's something about using the metronome, there's something about... Anyway, that's that idea of that book.
Yeah. Well, there are also included funny jazz anecdotes.
Right.
Yeah. Can you tell maybe one or two?
Oh, well, in that book, there are all so for me as a writer, I actually like writing. I went to college to be a fiction writer. That was my original plan. I thought I was going to write fiction. I used to write a lot of poetry. I wrote some fiction in college. If you ever read any of my fiction, you would say, oh, it's very good that he became a piano player. But I was hoping, and I also like to make jokes, and I make jokes all the time. I make jokes in all my classes. And so, it's funny because when that first book was published, I sent it to the Share Music Publishing, Chuck Share, who's a great publisher, a very wonderful person, and I sent him the manuscript, and he wrote back, if somebody's going to plunk down $35 for a book, you owe it to them to take it seriously. You got to take out some of these jokes. And I took out some of them, and then I went back and said, well, this one's only not moderately funny. And I said, let me take it. And then after I took out a bunch of them, the whole tone of the book changed. And I was like, you know what? You need the jokes, even the ones that aren't all that funny. You need them because it creates an environment in which, you can look at the idea of practicing as something that's potentially fun. So, there's a story in that book. Mostly they're related to specific, sort of musical practicing issues. One of the things I'm talking about at one point has something to do with how to move things from key to key. And I'm sort of trying to find a metaphor for that. And so I use this Star Trek. I guess you guys have that here, the old American TV program about space exploration. There's one of it's very, especially the old one was very corny in a lot of ways, but there's I used the storyline from the Star Trek episode, and I used that as a way of explaining how to find the flat 9 on a chord or whatever, so it's like I just try and tie it into something that's human and interesting. And actually, he wasn't going to publish that book, and then I rewrote it, and I sent it to him, and I said, I know you don't like this because it has too many jokes, and he said, no, this time I'm okay with it. And mostly the response has been that they appreciate that it's not this dry piece of writing. So those books, all of them, but especially especially that first one, was fun to write. I told stories about my musical life. I told stories about playing with Sonny Stitt and in house bands in Cleveland, and even stories about my father, who was an amateur pianist, and like what his approach to playing tunes were. I still have books and books of his that is the original sheet music of, like 50 cents, it says on the top of it, and it's like, Gershwin something, The Man I Love or something, with all the original sheet music with the ukulele chords on it, so it's like, I just included all of that in this, and I tend to include it in my classes too, if you're trying to make a point and you say, well, when I was playing with so-and-so, this happened, or, whatever, it's like, for me, the nice thing about writing a book or talking in class is that you can be your whole self. And I think that's the thing that allows people to stay connected to you. And if you get if it becomes too abstract and too dry, then it's just no fun for anybody.
Yeah, well, you also wrote the Jazz Singers Guidebook.
Yeah. How
did you came there, and what is the message, the general message in there? What is your relation with jazz singing? Yeah. And why you wrote this book?
Well, it has to do with Groningen. The first place that I ever had to teach vocalists consistently was here in Groningen at the Prins Conservatory, and I had a lot of singers that were studying with me. And I remember going to a singer class and asking the singer how she practiced being able to improvise over a song. And she said, the way I do it is by singing the melody many, many, many times. And I was like, that's it? That's the way you do it? And she was like, that's how I do it. And I was like, that's not a stupid idea, but it's a really indirect way to get to know the harmonic structure of a song. Like, it's not irrelevant, the melody. Of course, you can improvise around the melody. You can be a melodic improvisation. But she was talking about just singing the song over and over again with the melody. And I thought, well, I need to try and figure out a way to introduce harmony to vocalists. And, singers need a different set of skills, and they also have different problems. Mainly they're playing a slide whistle. That's the instrument that they have. There's no buttons on it, and you don't know where the one note starts and the other begins, or one note starts and one note ends. And also, there's nothing to visualize. If you're going to think of a G minor 7th scale, you can't just pick that, G Dorian, let's say it's a particular scale. You need to visualize that somehow. And either you can visualize it on the piano, which many people do, or you can visualize it on a staff. But you need, what I found is most schools that deal with jazz vocals. Either just put the singers in the same classes that everybody else takes, or they have classes that are geared towards them that end up being more sort of performance classes. This is something I did used to see here. I'm not very much in touch with the vocal stuff that happens here anymore, so I don't really know the answer. But, you know, there was one class I remember, I think it was here, where people talked a lot about the meaning of the song and the what the story of the song was, and, you know, they'd read the words like it was a poem and all this kind of stuff. That's all really valuable. I'm not minimizing the value of that, but if you don't deal with the instrumental ideas of the song, meaning what the pitches are, what's the harmony, what scale is it over, what are the chord scales of the tune, then you're never going to be able to converse in the language that instrumentalists converse in. So at the time when I started here, or not when I started, but shortly, because I started right at the beginning, but in the early years here, Dina DeRose, a great vocalist, was here, and she came to vocals by being a great piano player. So she had that same orientation that for vocalists, what they really need to do is understand an instrumental way of thinking. And so that was the goal of that book. In some ways, that book is like the first book in the sense that my goal for the vocalists was that they could spend productive time at the piano, working on tunes, practicing. You know, what I've found is that there are a lot of vocalists, and I've worked with, and some of them are great vocalists. It's not necessarily, you know, there's not a clear dividing line between the good ones and the bad ones, but there are great vocalists who are very intuitive and don't really practice music fundamentals. And they sing what they sing, and they just do it by ear, and they do it by feel, and that is fine. But we don't say that of sax players. Oh, well, he has a good feel. You know, he doesn't need to solo. He'll just play the melody with a lot of expressiveness and swing hard, and that's it. And I'm like, well, why should vocalists be different? You know, if you're a vocalist and you want to know more about the structure of music and you want to be able to hear scales and sing, you know, lines on chords, then you should be able to study that and make that part of your study. So the goal of that book was to teach singers how to practice. And I feel like that's what that, I mean, I teach a class in Queens College where I teach in New York. I teach a class, improvisation for vocalists. So now that book and the class have become kind of connected, and I'm not really sure where, you know, how much. I'll tell you one thing about that book that was very difficult was I wrote the entire book, and then my hard drive crashed and it all disappeared, and I wrote it again in 3 weeks. So sometimes when I read that book, there's like a little bit of breathlessness to it that I think is a little bit of an artifact of that. I'd say of the 3 books, it's the least funny, and that is probably why. I was not having so much fun when I was rewriting that book, but in general.
You have a special relationship with Japan, right? Mm-hmm. And also all the members of the New York Standards Quartet have this special relationship. Mm-hmm. There are Tim Armacost, mm-hmm. Daiki Yasu Kawagawa, and Gene Jackson. Uh-huh. Tell me, please, how do you understand beauty, especially in your relation with Japan and its understanding of beauty? Mm. And how this understanding of beauty, especially this Japanese way, also changed you as a musician, the way to play, to compose, and as a human being?
Yeah, the last part of that is the easiest part to say. I mean, first of all, I would be really missing an opportunity if I didn't mention that my Japanese concept of beauty is largely received from my Japanese wife, who is very beautiful. So, you know, that just takes care of that. Now, but I started going to Japan in the early 90s, and it really changed a lot of the way I think about a lot of things. I mean, one thing, having lived in New York for for over 30, almost 35 years, you know, American culture is pretty individualistic, and it's all about, I mean, the whole idea of being a jazz musician where you improvise and play your improvisations as that's your content is a little bit un-Japanese, I guess. It's kind of very individual oriented. Everybody has an individual voice, and here's mine, and listen to this, you know. But I think having lived in New York, which is a somewhat caustic, not very communitarian environment, where people are a little bit more out for the individual, it feels like. I found like that spending time in Japan taught me a lot of things about hospitality, about taking care of people. You know, and that actually fit with something in my personality. When I first went to Japan, I was so moved by how, you know, giving everybody was and how they placed the other person above themselves very often, and people really go out of their way for you. You know, I remember people who had like a day off and who were very busy, you know, heads of companies or whatever, and their day off they would come early and take you to see something, and then they would, you know, take you to dinner and just treat you, you know, all this kind of stuff, and that was new to me. You know, I have to say also in terms of beauty, Japan is one of the most beautiful countries I've ever been to, and you know, the sort of relationship of politeness and all this kind of stuff. It's very appealing, and one of my favorite things to do is to go to Zen gardens, and I go to a lot of them in Kyoto, and particularly in Kyoto, which is this gorgeous kind of it's the most sort of preserved old city in Japan, and so, you know, it just sort of became part of my life. You know, if you're a musician, sometimes you end up doing things that you would never have done, you know. So I have to say, I didn't grow up thinking a lot about the Netherlands, for example. You know, it's a wonderful and important and really terrific country. It's little, and it's far away from it. No, it's not that far away from the United States, but it's far enough that, you know, and the United States is not so good about noticing other countries anyway. It's a really big country, and most people speak only one language. So anyway, when I went to Japan for the first time in the 90s, I was really moved and struck by all this. And so I started working on Japanese. I started studying Japanese, and I studied pretty seriously for about 3 or 4 years. And during that study, actually, I met the woman that I eventually married, Shoko Nakajima, this terrific actress in person. And all that stuff came out of being a musician, you know, like traveling here, traveling to the Netherlands, traveling to Japan, traveling to Germany, traveling to New Zealand. Just did a lot of places that were not particularly on my radar. I'm actually not a huge travel buff or anything, you know. That's just something I got for nothing. And, you know, I think it's such a great gift to, you know, really the United States really, and the world suffers because of it, because it has such a parochial view of the world, you know. I mean, Europeans are always feeling this, I think, that the United States is this big, you know, rich, dumb country in a lot of ways that just hasn't joined the world community in certain respects, and yet kind of dominates it because it's the big bull and the, you know, economically. And you know, that's a shame. And I certainly, you know, I studied French in college, and I spent some time in France, although that was a country that was not tremendously welcoming, and I didn't really end up, you know, continuing with that. But when I went to Japan, it was so welcoming, and anyway, I guess the point I was really trying to make with this is that it really changed my outlook on the world, becoming more of a world citizen and less of a United States person. And I mean, there's this kind of jingoistic is a word we use, you know, this kind of chauvinistic quality to American culture. I remember after 9/11, I got to the United States maybe 4 days before that happened. I'd been in Japan, and the towers and all that, the planes hit, and, you know, there was this, and it was very close to my house, and it was just a very dismal feeling, and the air and the, you know, the soot and the stuff falling from the sky and all that stuff. And I remember talking to my mother on the phone, and she's saying, you know, I was saying, you know what, I wish I was in Japan right now. And she said, well, Japan has lots of problems. I was like, yeah, Japan has lots of problems. That's not an issue. But, you know, one thing about Japan is you always feel very comfortable and very safe. It's a very safe society, and it's kind of there's a lot of cute. They have a lot of cute in their culture. Anyway, I remember feeling, you know, wow, it would be great to be back in Japan right now. And she said, well, you know, there are a lot of people who still think the United States is number one. And I was like, what does that even mean? The United States is number one. I don't understand it. I mean, it's like it's not the highest literacy rate. It's not the, you know, it's not the most, in terms of, you know, you walk around those, I don't feel the safest here. I don't feel like, you know, I just feel like everywhere I've gone, there's a lot to learn from other countries. Having said that, I think that New York is a tremendous place to be a jazz musician. There's a lot to learn there, you know, and so there are certain benefits, but, you know, my perspective has broadened a lot from having the experience of traveling a lot. So I feel very connected to Japanese culture but also to European culture and to the, you know, to the rest of the world by not living in the kind of whatever that is, the somewhat sheltered view of the world that you have if you just grow up in. I mean, the United States right now, until recently, only 11% of the people had passports. So that means 89% of the people were never going to leave the borders of their country. And it went up recently to 25%. I think at this point 75% of the people don't have passports. And the reason why it went up is because it became necessary to have a passport to go to Canada or Mexico. So it's still just incredibly isolated, you know, so I think that's a unfortunate reality that we're all feeling the effects of.
Yeah. But what is your understanding of beauty? Can you tell me what is beautiful for you?
Well, I guess for me, beauty is, I mean, I don't usually think of it in those terms, and I don't even know if what I'm playing is beautiful, but I guess what I'm trying to do, I'm more interested in interest than beauty, probably. Like, I feel like in terms of my own musical approach, there are things that are really beautiful, of course, but I usually experience beautiful in music as being about some relationship to the elements of music. So for me, there's like interesting or intriguing harmony or some feeling, you know, like I also think that, you know, as a player, very often I experience music as a kind of emotion, you know, so you might be playing something and it has a certain kind of breath, you know, sort of hanging, you know, feeling like some mystery or something like that. So those kind of things are the ways that I tend to think of as positives for my playing. In terms of, you know, the Japanese, you sort of asked about that Japanese sense of beauty, and in that sense it's a certain kind of balance very often. You know, like I think the appeal of like a Zen garden is like it has this sense that, you know, like there's one leaf hanging from the tree, that like the dead leaf that just hangs in a certain way. It's this sort of perfect, you know, intensely balanced composition, you know. But I don't know the answer to that. I mean, Monk talks about, he has a tune called Ugly Beauty. So that's about sort of expanding the palette of what's beautiful. But I think my own tendency is probably to use other words than beauty to describe what I'm going for in music. And it's often like interest or ideas or something like that. That tends to be kind of how I think.
Okay. Well, can you tell me what the most beautiful sound is for you? Maybe you ever experienced, and
oh, that's really hard.
it can be in music, but it can also be in an environment, like a landscape or a building or something like that.
I don't know. I mean, I guess for me, probably the most beautiful sounds that I can think of are like musical moments. You know, so it's like you know, the turn of a phrase or like a certain melodic thing. You know, one thing that I think of as beautiful in music that's hard to put in words is melodies. So very often, especially now we have so much academics. There's so many like schools of jazz, jazz schools, and there's so much jazz in academic situations that the music has become more and more complex, and there's a lot of odd meter things, and you can think of many players who just live on a level of complexity that's pretty deep. And especially sort of some modern players. I mean, and I wouldn't say it has to necessarily be modern as opposed to old-timey or something like that, but there are certain modern players who have a very intellectualized sort of sense of what's going on. And I don't know, somebody like Steve Coleman or Steve Lehman is another one, or, and I mean, I like Steve Coleman's music very much, and I find his music very emotional. But I hear, and actually I'd rather not name any names of somebody I find overly intellectual, but there are people whose intellectualism is not so appealing to me, and usually it's because I don't hear a strong melodic connection. There's like no melody that's bringing me in the door. Sort of melody is that thing that kind of excites and makes you, in a really visceral, non-intellectual way, makes you relate to the music. So when I think of if I was going to think of what is like when you say most beautiful sound, I don't know about the most beautiful sound, but there's there's a tune with Charlie Hayden and Keith Jarrett on a duo record called Ellen David. I think it's Charlie Hayden's wife, maybe. Man, it is so beautiful. It's like there's those kind of moments. So there's that, or like, I don't know. There's a lot of different facets to beauty. One of the most compelling things that I heard in the last couple of years live was Herbie Hancock and Wayne Shorter playing duo. And it wasn't that it was so incredibly beautiful, it's that the conversation was just so intriguing. I mean, it was like there's something about the way he plays the piano that just couldn't be better. So, but I think there are these things that we're drawn to, and for me they're often melodic, where you just get this sense of. Another one for me would be Bill Evans' Paris Concert 2 Nardis intro. So that's something, it's very specific, but that could be it. That's a very beautiful sounding thing. Or Glenn Gould playing the Goldberg variations, or, there's just a lot, there's a lot of these moments, but there's moments that feel kind of transcendent, where even though a lot of the things that appeal to me are sort of based on ideas, it transcends, and it's just this really immediate speaking thing. It's not exactly the most beautiful sound, but I think that's as much as I can answer that one.
Yeah. Well, if there's no music in your life, and for sure you have moments that are free of music and even thinking about music, who are you there?
Well, I guess your personality is reflected in everything you do, right? So when I wrote that book, my personality's in the book. My personality's in, talking here. Like we're talking about music, that's true, but we're not playing anything. There's a piano right here. We could play something, but we're not gonna. So, I think in some ways who you are as a musician is just another reflection of that, who you are as a person. And when you're having a conversation, you have those times where it's all clicking, and it's not that different from what you're doing when you're playing and it's all clicking. It's still you engaging in some activity where you feel like you're realizing your potential. I think one thing, this isn't not exactly the question you're asking, but it's the thing that it reminds me of, which is probably the hardest thing about being a musician is transitioning between having periods where your music life is incredibly active, meaning you're really busy, sometimes too busy, to where you're not. And you're like, so one of the things is when you're on the road, you're not, you go to you're in a hotel, you're not cleaning up after yourself, you're not, you're not doing the dishes. When you're at home, you're doing the dishes and like paying your bills and making sure that you're whatever, your car, the tires get fixed on your, whatever. It's just like this series of, so we kind of transition back and forth between these very kind of, almost like childish kind of life where you're just on the road and people are taking you places and you get something to eat and then you go play. And it's like, it's this kind of incredible life where you have no responsibilities. And to that other life at home where you have all your responsibilities and you have all the things that you have to do. And I think most people who aren't musicians or who aren't engaged in some other kind of performance art don't have that experience. They just do the things they do. They see their friends, they go to work, they come home, they rake the leaves on their lawn, or I'm thinking about my sister who does a lot of gardening, but it's kind of constant. Maybe they go on vacation and then they come back and it's still, but there's like a kind of routine, and we don't really have that. So one of the real challenges is to have like a productive life all the time. And I think, people go back and forth on it. And that for me, I would say is really one of the biggest challenges of my life is to engage whatever, and not just, veg out, on the road, and, to try and be productive and reading books and doing things and having an active life. I've done a lot of different things. Like I said, I thought I was going to be a writer for a while and not a musician. But, you can engage as much as you're capable of. So I think that's the thing we're always trying to get better and better at.
Thank you very much.
Sure, you're welcome. That's the end?
Yeah.
We're done?
Yeah.
That's the end of the questions?
Yes.
All right, wow, great.
You're free.
Thank you. No, it's fun.
Great, thank you very much.
I don't need a lot of prompting. I can usually talk forever on any topic.
I know. That's good. We will see each other again.
Good, okay, that's great. Oh, good, yeah.
Great.
The first set of interviews I ever did was when my first record, Handmade, came out. And they were very aggressive about, doing radio interviews and stuff. And so I would go down to the office, and they'd have a whole bunch of radio guys on the phone. And one of the things I learned was, because some people ask really terrible questions. They just ask awful questions.
Like?
That's a good question. I wish I could remember some of them. They would just ask you things that would just be really not helpful. Anyway, if you have a record and you want to talk about it, you talk about the record. It doesn't. I felt a little bit like a politician. It doesn't really matter what question they ask. You're going to talk about what you can talk about. I didn't do it much to you, but there were sometimes you ask me a question, and I'm like, beautiful sound. I'm not sure I can answer that one. So all these questions are always just jumping off points for things that you can talk about. It's more important that you say something that